Today, why are mortgage deals being pulled? Will the COVID inquiry change anyone's mind? And is artificial intelligence a threat to our elections? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP and former Minister Brendan Clarke-Smith, Labour MP Carolyn Harris, Zoe Grunewald of The New Statesman and the founder of Conservative Home, Tim Montgomery. Today, more turmoil in the mortgage market.
2 weeks ago, I got a letter saying, in line with the interest rates, your repayments are going up to £1,130, which is quite a hike.
As banks and building societies pull more deals, we ask who's to blame. Also today,
people should know that I do want to bring taxes down. Now, it's important right now that we tackle inflation. That is the #1 economic priority.
are tax cuts the solution to rising bills? This woman is leading the COVID inquiry, which gets underway next week. How well prepared were we for the pandemic? And artificial intelligence can generate fake images like these. Could it pose a threat to our elections? Let's start today's programme with something different. Headline here in The Times. Bear Grylls. Schools leave children ill-equipped for life. Adventurer and Chief Scout says that teachers are underpaid and run off their feet while pupils are not being taught life skills. The opening question then for our guest today, starting with you, Brendan. Are schools leaving children ill-equipped for life?
Well, I'm going to stick up for teachers, being one myself, certainly in a former life. And it's not up to schools to teach this as well. It's parents as well, and it's wider society. So those life skills you would expect to be learned elsewhere. But of course, we're investing in things like apprenticeships. We've stuck £2.3 billion into that. There's T-levels. So from an academic point of view, we're trying to do that. But in terms of general values, whether that's life-saving skills, whether that's things like sign language that we've introduced in various places as well. I mean, yes, there's always room to develop more skills. My little boy loves Bear Grylls and watches him regularly. But again, schools can't do everything. I think we have to remember that. Some
of the skills that are listed by Bear Grylls, he says these are the things that really matter in life. They're rooted in attitudes, relationships, skills and knowledge. I mean, schools are supposed to teach these sorts of things, but is the curriculum perhaps tilted in the wrong way?
And I think society changes, doesn't it? And it throws up different challenges which schools are not prepared and teachers are not prepared for because they've not learnt how to deal with them. Things like problem gambling, things like banking, relationship stuff, knife crime, kids need to understand what the social challenges out there. What we need to do is to invest in the schools and give them the money to actually bring in the experts to teach the kids the stuff. You can't expect a teacher who's never looked at these subjects to suddenly become an expert on them. You need to get people from the banking industry and you need to get the right people to do the job, give them the money to give the kids the tools.
Do you agree that schools are leaving children ill-equipped for life?
I think they are, and I don't think that's necessarily the fault of teachers. I don't think anyone's here to attack teachers because I think teachers are at the mercy of the funding and the resources they're given. I think, unfortunately, because schools are under such huge amounts of pressure financially and in terms of resources, they are really pushing kids to just pass their exams, and that is the measure of success that they've been given. But actually, and I pick up on a point Brendan said, of course it'd be great if parents could teach their kids all those life skills, but some parents simply don't have capacity. Some parents, for a number of reasons, children who grew up in deprivation might not be able to get those skills from their parents if they are in care homes, for example, or any other kind of circumstance. So I do think schools have a responsibility to provide that sort of education for kids. And, I would have loved, when I came out of school, to know how mortgages work, to know how credit cards work, to have proper, adequate relationship and sex education, to be taught about debt, all those things which I think are really important. But I don't think necessarily parents always have the capacity to teach their kids.
Is it too much about exams and not about real-life lessons?
I think it is, and it certainly is at the early stages of life. And I think one of the most exciting initiatives taken recently is actually by the Princess of Wales. Kate, she's set up a charity, an organisation to really explore what it is that you provide children in the earliest years of life that could really make a difference. And there are plenty of victims of the pandemic, children who weren't socialised during those years when we were locked down. And so it's not just a common problem, it's particularly acute post-lockdown. And so I think it's great that we have such a senior member of the royal family championing this cause, and hopefully it will champion best practice for all schools, teachers to follow.
We're going to talk about the COVID inquiry later on in the programme, but let me draw your attention to this headline in The Guardian. UK banks pull hundreds more home loan deals as fixed mortgage rates rise. Yes, there seems to be a huge amount of turmoil again for people trying to get mortgages, and it's already had a knock-on effect. Let's have a listen to this.
It is feeling like I'm in a bit of a tailspin, which I'm sure a lot of other people are feeling the same way. And it's just very stressful, really disheartening, and just like I'm never really going to get anywhere. I think for me, I'm just going to be sitting and waiting, really. It's just going to be a long waiting game until things calm down.
Brendan, that was Jo Wilder struggling to buy her first property in Cardiff amidst the latest chaos. Why do you think there's so much turmoil with mortgage rates again?
Well, this is why it's so important to get that inflation down, because inflation is the cause of all this. The Bank of England are reacting to that, and we all expect interest rates to change, but it's the pace of that change, I think, is the problem. If you've not planned ahead, if you've maybe overstretched yourself a little bit, we've been having historically low interest rates for quite a long time now, and of course, with the cost of housing at the moment and the supply that's there, people are having to put a lot of money in or having more and more loans to actually do that. So this is why we don't want to work at cross purposes with the Bank of England. We want to make sure that we do get inflation down so they can have interest rates really that aren't going to hammer people.
But what do you say to people like Jo who are already having to pay higher prices because of inflation? Yes, it's come down a bit, but it's remaining stubbornly high. Those price rises are slowing, but they're still going up. And yet the Bank of England is putting up interest rates. That's going to only load even more of a burden on people's bills.
Yeah, and of course, as you said, inflation is going down. The Prime Minister's looked at halving it, and that is the absolute key to it. We've got to do that, because that is what the knock-on effect will be, and that is how we tackle the cost of living.
Brendan hasn't really answered, though, why he thinks there's so much turmoil in the sort of mortgage market. Why do you think it is?
Liz Truss?
You think it's all her fault?
Well, I mean, that 45 days were absolutely disastrous, and we just not recovered from it. I bought my first house when I was 18. I paid £7,000 for my first house. I'm now talking to people who are in their 40s who can't buy their first house. Solicitors, professionals, you know, you can talk about halving inflation. That's not how people are feeling. People are feeling that their backs against the wall. They can't afford to buy their homes. They can't rent and buy their homes, which means they can't save for a deposit. They can't even afford to pay for their weekly shopping. So you may think that this is all working, but the feel factor is this country's on its knees and people are suffering.
Liz Truss.
But well, I think you've got to look at the global picture, and 4.5% in many countries would actually be a very low interest rate. So I don't think it's right to blame Liz Truss for that. Interest rates have been going up across the world. We've had food prices going up. We've had inflation everywhere else as well. So this isn't a problem that's isolated to the UK. This is something that's actually going on everywhere.
I think Liz Truss was probably the most disastrous Prime Minister of recent times. But, Caroline, you can't blame her for everything. If
she has.
Obviously, but British interest rates aren't that different from European and American rates. The problem at the moment is there is uncertainty about the immediate future of interest rates. Once that uncertainty's passed, which is probably 2-3 months away, we'll probably see the mortgage market settle. But just for the moment, because mortgage companies don't know what Bank of England interest rate will be next month or the following month because of the stubbornness of inflation, we're seeing a little bit of this uncertainty. But it isn't Liz Truss's fault. It's global markets' fault, and it will probably be easing within 3 or 4 months.
Do you agree with that, Zoe? I mean, this is the Daily Mirror headline. They agree with Caroline, or Caroline agrees with them. Liz Truss is blamed for inflation chaos as mortgage lenders hike rates yet again. Now, it's certainly true that Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, has said in a Treasury evidence session recently the impact of the Truss mini-budget from last year has pretty much gone now. Is it her fault, or do you agree with Tim?
Well, she injected a lot of uncertainty into the market, absolutely. But I think one of the main problems is that one of the main problems for people day to day is that their repayments are so high. And the reason their repayments are so high is because house prices are so high. And one of the reasons house prices are so high is because we do not have enough houses in this country.
True.
But we have had historically low interest rates, haven't we?
We have, yes. So there was obviously an injection of some turmoil in the market when Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget happened. But, I mean, this was always going to be a bubble that was going to eventually pop. And what we are seeing now is the result of just too few houses for the amount of people who need them, and a massive emphasis on people buying houses and having stretched themselves to get on the property ladder without any kind of long-term sustainable planning.
I mean, what do you say to Andrew Bailey? I mean, not directly, but in response to what he has said, that actually the impact of that Truss mini-budget has pretty much gone now and we are back to where we were before.
I'm not seeing it. That's not what I'm hearing from my constituents. That's not what I'm hearing when I go around the supermarket. I just feel the pain. People are feeling the pain.
Well, they may feel the pain, but is it down to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng?
Well,
still?
I think they have a huge amount of responsibility for what happened. And if it's just the insecurity, as Zoe said, people are still feeling the pain of this.
Right. I mean, the Bank of England is obviously pretty sure about it. But what do you say, Brendan? If that's what people feel, that mini-budget had a huge impact at the time and it's lingering in people's minds.
It does, but I think there is also the opinion that if you look at a lot of the things that Liz Truss does, she's actually was proven right in a number of cases in terms of stimulating the economy as well. I don't think it's fair to blame Liz Truss for everything. I got hammered the other way round with interest rates at the sort of in the noughties. I remember sort of paying a certain rate. I set it, and then of course the market crashed, house prices crashed, and interest rates went very low, and many people were stuck on very high mortgages when the rates were low. So it does work both ways there, but we're working to do something about it. And I think the point that Tim was making as well, and this is a temporary thing, and this is what we've got to get under control.
I mean, do you think the Bank of England deserves some responsibility, perhaps, for coming in too late with the start of their increasing of interest rates?
The Bank of England is an independent organisation, and it's really important that we keep that independence.
Of course, but you can still blame them for making the wrong decision.
Well,
in your mind.
I think they've made the decision that they've made at the time they felt it was appropriate to make it. And I'm not going to interfere with the Bank of England
I used
strategy.
to be at the Bank of England. Actually, joined the Bank of England 2 months before we crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism. So it wasn't great timing. But the key thing about inflation, if you want to control inflation, is the best way is to hit it hard and quick, to begin to bring expectation under control. And I think the problem with central banks around the world is they raised interest rates too gradually, too softly. They were trying to, in a way, shield us from the consequences of what they're doing. It was a good motivation, but actually what we needed was a shock to expectations to bring inflation under control. And actually this slow, steady attempt to tackle inflation has meant that it's persisted for longer. So I think the Bank of England next time will take a different approach. They've got it wrong on this occasion.
Do you agree with that, Zoe?
Well, I think it's going to make a lot of people feel very anxious to hear that they should expect a bigger shock next time, because I think for a lot of people the shock has been really extreme. I mean, those people who took out, who bought a home during the stamp duty holiday back in 2021 or whenever it was, and now 2 years later have to renew their mortgage, it's shocking the amount that they'll have to pay. We heard it before. So, I mean, I don't exactly know whether the Bank of England should have acted sooner. I'm not entirely sure. But what I do know is that there are people behind this, and they're the ones who will suffer if you have a more extreme shock.
Right. I mean, if external factors have been to blame for rising inflation, which is what the government has told us, whether it was the pandemic, whether it was the Ukraine war, how does raising interest rates domestically help, Brendan?
It's inflation as well, again. I mean, we've got to make sure that we've got our public finances in the right place. So look at the amount of money that we spent during the pandemic as well. That's something that we've got to be very careful about. So I just think that we basically need to get back to managing finances properly, making sure that we don't overspend, making sure that we don't put that burden on the taxpayer. And then at the same time, people have been asking for wage increases, double digits. And if we did that, then the situation would be a lot worse and the rates would be even higher.
Right. Do you think this could be a solution to making people feel better? This headline in the Sunday Telegraph: Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, wants 2p tax cut before next general election. Is that affordable?
I'm sure it will be if that's what's being proposed, yeah.
Well, what do you think? Should taxes be cut?
Well, if you have a look at what Jeremy Hunt has done, he's actually said we're going to steady the ship as it is and the tax cuts will come later at a sensible time. So this would actually leave a window of opportunity to be able to do that. Of course, you would expect governments generally tend to do that nearer general elections. I would hope that anything that we can do to cut the cost of living for families and people who are working would be certainly very popular. But I also think it's a responsible thing to do as well, because people are paying a very high tax burden at the moment, not just to recover from COVID, but because of all these global factors. It just gives them a little bit of breathing space.
Would you like to see lower taxes? I mean, Labour goes on about it being the highest tax burden in 70 years. Is that the answer?
Fairer taxes. We need fairer taxes.
And is that lower taxes?
Well, it'll be fairer. It'll be spread across. Why are we nom-doms, for example, subsidising private schools? We need to be looking at the kinds of things that's being taxed now, and we need to rejig that around so we go the right way. But I mean, this headline, this is a government who's now saying potentially we'll have a tax rate next year, just ahead of a general election. This is the government in charge.
Who'd have thought of that being political?
Exactly. I mean, this is the government. We shouldn't be having anticipated tax cuts. They should know where they're going and what they're doing. That's the problem with this government. They completely lost it. They've got no ideas, they've got no plan, and they are just desperately trying to claw fingernails into that wall to hang on and get through the next election. And I'm afraid they're done.
Brendan?
Well, stopping the boats, cutting the backlog, halving inflation.
You don't need to...
The plan is there, the plan is there.
The plan is there, but is it being delivered, Brendan?
Well, we're getting there. Certainly inflation is coming down. If you look at some of the data on the boats, the deals we've done in Albania, we're getting there as well. The Rwanda scheme hopefully will...
All right, but what about on the economy?
Certainly, I think we're steadying the ship there. I think inflation is getting a little bit more towards the level we want it to be. And again, global pressures, but I think we're doing the right thing. I think we're moving in the right direction. And I still think that we'll win that next general election.
Oh, right. OK, well, there's confidence for you. Tim, how big, did you say bless? How much trouble is Rishi Sunak in when it comes to the issue of tax cuts with his own party?
Massive.
Is it?
Problem. The thing is, look, Caroline can't name a tax cut. Labour aren't the party of low taxation, whatever they say. But the idea that voters at the head of the next election, after seeing their taxes go up in the most stealthy way, they haven't had the courage, the Conservatives, to increase taxes, income tax, by putting, say, a penny or 2 penny on the income.
No, they've frozen the thresholds.
Yeah. Which, pulls the poorer, lower income people into the tax system. Voters aren't stupid. They're not going to suddenly believe that the Tories are a party of low taxation if a tax cut is made ahead of the general election. And that's why, back to your question, Jo, Tory MPs are so unhappy, because I think they know they want something because they're desperate. But actually, they know that actually the chances of any tax announcement ahead of the next election really changing the political weather is for the birds.
Right. I mean, you can't really call yourself a low-tax party anymore, can you?
Well, the pandemic's had to be paid for, and this didn't come for free, of course, and we had to spend a lot of money. Things like the furlough scheme now, that's not something normally that I would imagine that I would have supported, but we did because it was the right thing to do at the time. That needs paying for. Same as before, people talk of austerity, and we're coming on to that a little bit later.
Brendan, though, we had a majority of 80. A historic opportunity to reform the country. I don't know what Margaret Thatcher would have done with a majority of 80, but she might have done things like Zoe said, build houses, cut the cost of massive housing benefit that we have to pay for as taxpayers all the time, reform energy markets so there's more competition, so consumers got a better deal. We haven't done any of that. It's the waste of the majority that Boris Johnson won in 2019 is why the upward pressure on tax is so great. The pandemic could have been paid for over a long period. It's these general ongoing costs that are the problem.
Brendan?
Well, yeah, I think in terms of supply and getting those things done, I think you've got a point, Tim, and these are things that we actually want to do. I do think the pandemic has slowed us down, but certainly that vision, that's certainly what people want. We want to be building the homes, not just blanket building them everywhere, building the right kind of homes that people can actually afford, and of course building the infrastructure with it as well, which I think is one of the big issues. And yes, of course, that vision. I was a member of the Truss administration. Of course, there was a vision there. Some people felt it moved too quickly, of course. And sometimes you get punished for
the market. And
again, the Bank of England as an example with the interest rates.
Yeah.
If they'd have put them up, would they be punished for it? So sometimes you have to be brave. You're right, an 80-seat majority is the time to be brave. And we've still got a year and a half to go until the election. And I'm sure there'll be some brave steps that we take.
Is there a public appetite for tax cuts? Or, Zoe, do you think people would understand perhaps a hike in taxes or the redistribution perhaps that Carolyn is talking about to invest in public services?
So I think basically what's happening here is that people are living in a cost of living crisis and they're being told, wouldn't you like more money in your pocket? And of course everyone goes, yes, that'd be really nice. But I think actually what people want is for their public services to work. People don't want the NHS, don't want hospitals to be held up by stilts. They don't want schools that their kids go to be crumbling. People want to see investment in public services, and there is a public appetite for that. If we're being realistic, doing tax cuts now is only going to affect those public services. Less government money means less money for public services. And I don't think anybody wants to see that. And going forward, we have got an ageing population, we've got an impending climate crisis, we've got a public appetite for better services. There is no way that tax cuts will be able to achieve any of those things or get on top of any of those things if we take more money away from the
problem,
government.
though, is if we constantly increase taxes for the good reasons that you say, the economy will stutter, because ultimately entrepreneurs, people do not invest in countries with high levels of taxation. So I think we have to, and I think we're at a tipping point, and this was the thing that the insight that Liz Truss had that was correct. We're at a tipping point where if we put up taxes much more, we will see some of the most important businesses, the most able people, there'll be a brain drain out of this country. And that's my worry about a Labour government. They will send the economy over the cliff with their idea of fair taxation, Carolyn. When I hear fair taxation from someone like you, I just think it's high taxation, and that's not what the economy
I think
needs.
we've moved on from that, Tim. I think everybody knows the Labour Party's moved on. Under Keir Starmer's leadership, we're not going to be the Corbyn government that people were so fearful of.
Well, it wasn't a government, of course. It was an opposition.
But people feared that we would be. No, we're talking about a completely different party with a completely different ethos.
But you have made a very big commitment, potentially expensive. If we look at the headline, it was made a few years ago, but this was to borrow to invest £28 billion a year in tackling climate change. The Mail is saying families face £1,000 a year bill for Labour eco plans. It's also saying Keir Starmer's wobbling on this issue. I mean, do you think those plans look in doubt because they're not affordable? I mean, how would you manage to borrow to invest £28 billion a year when the cost of borrowing has shot up? The days of super low interest rates are over. That's when those plans were formulated. Can you afford to do it?
Keir will not be going into government without having clearly thought out every move he's going to make, and people underestimate him if they think that he is. A lot of this is going to be media speculation, and I would wait and see what actually...
Which is going to be the media speculation? That the plans go ahead or that he drops it?
Until it comes out of Keir's mouth, and we know what's in that manifesto and what his plan is, the rest is going to be hyperbole. We need to see what the man himself is going to say.
But the plan is to borrow, to invest in those climate change policies or policies to tackle climate change. It looks far less affordable than it did a few years ago because of the cost of borrowing. And that would mean you'd have to put up people's taxes to pay for it. And that may be the right thing. Would you be prepared to do that?
Well, I think if, like Zoe said, if we were to put up taxes to pay for things like the NHS and schools, I don't think people would have a problem with that because they want the best services. I personally would be more than happy to pay more tax if I thought it was going into schools. Yeah, I would. I mean, I've always said that.
Right. So you would. Well, you say but perhaps that is what people want. If they really felt it was going to be invested in public services, is it just about being honest about these things?
Well, it is about being honest. And the problem is if Labour win the next election, they're not going to have a big majority. It's not going to... people don't like arrogance, Carolyn. Be careful about that. But, you know, Labour will not win the Tony Blair-style majority that was on 97. There'll be... Labour MPs will hold the balance. They may even have a minority government. And it will be the attitude of, frankly, Labour MPs like Carolyn, who, in their instincts, want to put up taxes.
And Chris Bryant, actually, when
whatever Keir Starmer may want, there'll be enough Labour MPs on the left, still in his party, perhaps in coalition in some form with the SNP in Scotland, pulling Labour to the left. And so whatever Keir Starmer may say, and we'll, of course, listen very carefully to his words, Carolyn, it may not be what the Labour Party force on him in Parliament.
No, I mean, no... It's not about left and right. It's about Keir and his government doing the right thing. We've had We've had 13 years of sheer hell.
But your instincts matter, the instincts of the Parliamentary Labour Party and whoever you might be in coalition with
and we're certainly not going to the left. You know, we are a moderate party, and that is what the country needs now. The country needs a change. It needs fresh ideas. It needs people who can come up with new ideas to take us forward. We cannot continue with the status quo. It's got to change.
I mean, it's interesting, the terms moderate, left and right. In the end, when you're talking about the policies and the way that Tim and Carolyn are discussing, is there a case to be made, as Carolyn said, for higher taxes?
I think what really needs to be done, and I think Labour needs to be clear about how the money's going to be spent, what it means, but I think also making it clear to the public that, OK, maybe there will be something like more taxes, but that doesn't mean everyone's going to be worse off every month. It means there'll be better public services. It should stimulate the economy. And when we're talking about this £28 billion pledge, that's loads of jobs. So Starmer says that should be loads.
But do you accept they might have to raise taxes rather than borrow the money?
Maybe so, but maybe people will be better off after that. If it stimulates the economy, creates jobs, makes things better, it doesn't necessarily mean people will be worse off after that.
But the unions don't believe that, and they've been very critical of the plans for North Sea oil and this £28 billion that's been put there. Again, will this cause inflation that's there? Now, if even the unions are criticising these plans, and we're talking about whether it's a left or right thing, if their own supporters can't back Sir Keir Starmer's plans, how are the electorate going to?
People struggling to get to work on trains at the moment will love the fact that you're going to give more power to the unions, Carolyn.
I didn't say we were going to give more power to the unions. I
well,
said
you basically
we were
did.
going to create good union jobs. We recognise that we have to work in partnership with the unions to create good, sustainable jobs. And I would suggest that we listen to what Keir said at the GMB conference today before we make any second guesses as to where he is with the unions.
Or just stop oil stopping the trains.
All right, well, let's talk about the COVID inquiry, because it's going to start hearing evidence next week, starting with the UK's preparedness for the pandemic. They'll also be looking, of course, at a range of other issues, including political decision-making, the impact on healthcare systems across the UK and vaccines. We've already heard, actually, from the inquiry's chair, and I think we can show you the preliminary hearings that are still underway. But Baroness Heather Hallett was talking about the big row between the government and the inquiry about messages and documents and what should be handed over, and we discussed that at length yesterday. You can watch in one part of the screen there what's going on in terms of the preliminary hearing, but we're going to focus on something slightly different. And this is about how the government handled the pandemic and whether or not these hearings and this COVID inquiry will change anyone's mind about how they think the government handled the pandemic. Do you think it will change anyone's mind, or are people firmly entrenched in their view, Tim?
I think we are 5 years away from very, very few people defending lockdown at all. And Carolyn and I have been disagreeing on this programme, but we're both members, supporters of the Centre for Social Justice, and both of us have recently seen, I was up in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago with Ian Duncan Smith, 20 years after he made his famous visit there, you may remember, Jo. And the middle class may have moved on from lockdown, but you look where the people really at the bottom of the pile are. Their youth services have still been devastated. You know, their youth workers, delivering now or working in supermarkets, they're no longer there when actually the need for youth services is greater. The shop on the isolated estate that was just about surviving before the pandemic has now closed down. And then something you've been covering, I know, quite a bit, Jo, you've got massive absence of kids from schools. The lockdown was understandable, particularly when we didn't know whether we were dealing with the bubonic plague or whatever. But the continuation of it for so long, the consequences for disadvantaged communities are going to become more and more apparent. And I hope that's what the COVID inquiry will focus on as well, not just the nature of how we protected ourselves from the disease.
Yeah, and I agree entirely with Tim on that. And it's not just the people who are who've been on the low incomes who are suffering. We don't know how many kids have witnessed domestic violence during the lockdown. How many kids have been exposed to inappropriate behaviour from the people they live with. How many of those kids will not go back to school? They can't go back to school. They are the ghost children, I think they've been called. And I'm really, really concerned about what the future is going to hold for these kids.
So were the lockdowns wrong?
I'm not going to say the lockdowns were wrong because it was unprecedented.
Yes,
we did not. What I'm going to say is public services before that were in a bad state. We've come out of it and they're in a worse state. I've spoke to people who were police officers who've actually gone to work for delivery companies because there was more money in it.
Yeah.
Teachers, classroom assistants. And the only kids that we're actually touching on now are the kids who are engaged, the kids who are going to school. We're not doing anything with the kids who are out they've ended up in a county lines gang, or they've ended up being locked in a bedroom for the last 3 years. They are just disappeared off the face of the earth, and we've not got the resource or the services to go to them and to bring them back in.
Do you think when we've gone through this inquiry and Baroness Hallett has looked at all of the issues to some extent in the way they've been outlined by Tim and Carolyn, that people will change their view about, or make a judgment if they haven't done, about how the Boris Johnson government handled the pandemic?
Not necessarily, but I think it's important people have answers, and I think whatever people did during the pandemic, they acted in good faith on the advice that was provided to them. Now, some of us wanted to come out of lockdown sooner, some of us didn't believe it in at all. Obviously, we were saying that Labour wanted to keep us in longer, but I'm not going to criticise people for that because, again, I'm sure that was done with the best intentions as well that were there. I was a Plan B rebel. I wanted to, it's the only thing I actually rebelled in Parliament because I wanted to see an end of it. But again, I think we need to concentrate on the future and where we are as well. I think you can dwell on it too much. I think the points that everybody's making about kids attending school, what's actually happened in our communities, getting people back out onto the high street, doing all of these things, working from home, how that's affected us. These are going to affect people's lives more. I think if you just do too much navel gazing about you should have done that, you should have done this, it becomes a blame game and it doesn't help anybody.
Right. Well, you talk about the blame game. I mean, this is the headline in The Independent because there are reports that say actually the former Prime Minister David Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne will be called to give evidence over the austerity policies that left the UK hugely unprepared for COVID, says the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. Is that fair? Is it worth looking at that issue in terms of the preparedness of Britain ahead of the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what Carolyn said. Before the pandemic, public services, community services, health services, education were all in pretty dire straits, to be honest. And the pandemic completely worsened all of those things, you know. What I think is really needs to be pulled out in this inquiry is that David Cameron presided over a pandemic preparedness strategy. He was Prime Minister when that strategy was released. Then he implemented this decade of austerity. The idea that there was no calculation in his mind as to what would happen, how these cuts on public services would impact if there was a pandemic, is quite shocking to me. And I think it's something the inquiry will look at and uncover, because we already saw that hospitals were at breaking point before
they were running at very high capacity.
Absolutely. Doctors were already talking about staffing shortages. They were already talking about a lack of resources. And we knew there was a pandemic coming eventually.
Well, I mean, what do you think about that, Tim? Because you passionately laid out that poorer communities really suffered and are still suffering. Do you think there is truth in the lack of preparedness because public services were stripped to the bone, according to the TUC? And
I think that some of the life in those communities was getting better before the pandemic struck. You know, over the last 20 years, when I've been associated with the Centre for Social Justice, we've seen a lot of reforms take place, a lot of extra funding of youth services. The universal credit has generally been good at simplifying the benefits system. But what happened, I don't think you can just discount how bad the lockdown was for these communities. Youth services didn't get the continued funding that they needed, etc. So I think we can look back, and it's a temptation all politicians want to do. The key thing now is, how do we solve the situation we face? The middle classes, lockdown is almost a thing in the past for them. Working from home often suits a lot of them. But for people who really still had to turn up for, jobs where you can't ever work from home, where perhaps the schools aren't so good, where family breakdown is greater, the problems these communities now face are greater than they have ever been, and that's what the challenge we must face up to.
It was lockdowns rather than austerity that has made life so much more...
It was a mixture of both. It was definitely a mixture of both. I mean, people were struggling before the pandemic, but the combination of the two has devastated so many communities.
Do you think it's fair, that criticism of the TUC?
Well, why did we have austerity in the first place? There is no money left. It was the note we were left there, of course, but we had to make difficult decisions. Now,
as you know, it was a global financial crash, but it was done, austerity, as the government would say at the time, in response to dealing with that global financial crash.
And, of course, preparedness. We've not done that badly. Of course, we've developed the vaccine. We came out of lockdown before many other countries as well. It was a global phenomenon that was very difficult to deal with, and whichever country has dealt with it, it was going to be a very difficult situation that's going to be there however you dealt with it. So again, it's easy to apportion blame for it, but I don't think we did too badly in this country. I think we did many positive things that are there as well. But this is why this focus has got to go on what we're going to do about it next. And it goes back to people's mortgage interest rates, it goes back to people's jobs, people's pay, and it's all the knock-on effects of it. That's what we really need to focus on, again, not blaming people for things that could have or should have been done 20-odd years ago.
But we do need to look at where things went wrong, and we do need to figure out why. So why did Johnson not attend certain COBRA meetings in the beginning stages, and why did we lock down later than other countries, and why did Cheltenham races go ahead? I mean, I had a family member who got really ill at the Cheltenham races because that still went ahead, and they were under the impression that was a safe place to go. It wasn't a safe place to go. So there were decisions that weren't made properly, and people need to be held accountable for that. If you're in government, you need to be held accountable. Right,
so you are looking, obviously, for blame, for accountability and responsibility.
I think when you say blame, it makes it sound like, you know, you're out for blood. But I think people need to learn, the only way you learn lessons if you figure out where things went wrong and who should take responsibility.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Sunday Times. Sajid Javid, former Chancellor, former Health Secretary, on election day. I fear we'll see how harmful artificial intelligence can be. New technology has to be our servant, not our master. In the US this week, this will be high on Rishi Sunak's agenda. That's his visit to the States. Let's talk to Professor Michael Wooldridge, Director of AI at the Turing Institute in London and Professor of Computer Science at Oxford University. Welcome to you, Professor. What are the risks that you're worried about in terms of how AI could be used in elections?
So the AI technology that we've all become used to over the last couple of months, the ChatGPT and Bard, what AI people call large language models, what they're designed to do, to fundamentally do, is to produce very, very realistic sounding text to order. Now, most of the uses of that are completely mundane. They're just kind of the things that we would do in an office, summarizing a piece of text or cross-referencing some text and so on. But the point is that in their unguarded state, without appropriate safeguards, you can ask them to generate fake news, and they will do that on an industrial scale, and they will do an incredibly good job of it. And the worry is that as we head into elections in the UK and the US, that what we're going to see is social media drowning in extremely plausible fake news, disinformation stories. That's what the concern is.
I mean, who would do this and why?
Well, I think there's a whole host of people who would do it. I think there are probably teenagers across the country with an idle interest in just vandalizing the democratic process. In the same ways that, teenagers might have an idle interest in vandalizing anything. But actually, more seriously, there are clearly state level actors who would love to destabilize elections in the UK and the US. And we don't need to name them. We don't need to think very hard about who they might be. But I think for sure they are out there. And those state level actors absolutely would have access to the technology without any safeguards whatsoever.
Right. And is it the scale, when you talk about an industrial scale, is that the difference between the sorts of claims of disinformation that people referred to in 2016, particularly during the EU referendum and the presidential election in the States?
Yeah, and it was the misinformation, the disinformation that we were seeing there was produced by human beings, and it was on a relatively small scale. What this technology can do is it can personalize it to any given individual. So let me just give you a scenario.
Yeah.
Suppose you're on social media and you post a series of postings on social media, and let's say you're basically a Labour voter, but you're a bit unhappy about the history of the Labour Party with anti-Semitism. So, and that comes out in your social media feed. AI can analyze your social media feed, pick up on that, and then feed you with disinformation stories to drive a wedge in. Or conversely, if you're inherently a Conservative voter, but you're a bit unhappy about, about what the Conservative Party have done for small businesses. Again, if that's on your social media feed, AI can pick up on that and feed you with disinformation stories that are just confirming that preconception that you have and driving a wedge in there. And it can be personalized down to the level of communicating the kind of language that a teenager might use, or even the kind of language that a teenager in Merseyside might use, or a teenager in Middlesbrough might use, or a Tory voter in the home counties. And it can industrialize it because it can just automate this process. It can do this and a very high quality disinformation on an industrial scale. And at the moment, I just don't see any reason why that wouldn't happen. I think, the ChatGPT and Bards have got what are safeguards, safety rails built in to try and stop doing that. But you don't have to have a PhD in AI to be able to find systems where without those guardrails, state level actors certainly have access to them. And so I think there is a very real risk there.
Right, but then what can you do about it? I mean, it sounds terrifying and sort of beyond our control to put in any guardrails in the way you've described it.
So responsible AI companies and the large companies, the household name companies that are dealing with this are frantically trying to do exactly that. It's imperfect at the moment, and they're rightly being taken to task for the failings of their safeguards on a daily basis. But actually, I think we've got to look to social media companies in particular to decisively get their act together. And the real worry, I think, is one immediate one, is we've all seen and talked about the changes at Twitter over the last year. So recently, we saw these terrible shootings in a mall in Dallas, and there was very graphic video and photographs of the aftermath of that were posted on Twitter and weren't picked up for hours. And the worry is that in amongst all the changes that have happened to Twitter, there used to be people basically whose job was to do exactly that, to intercept exactly that kind of post and pick up on it. And the worry is now that because of what's happened to Twitter in particular, but all social media companies have had massive layoffs, that they've got some capability to do that. So we need social media companies. Governments need to talk to social media companies to decisively get their act together.
What do you make of what you've heard, first of all, from the professor? Do you think those sorts of solutions are absolutely critically important for now?
Well, it sounds like it, doesn't it? It sounds really, really scary. I think, absolutely, we need the government to move fast with regulation. I do think it's a good thing that we're talking about it on such a big scale now. I think there's clearly an appetite from the public and from the government to act on this. I know, I think it was reported this morning that Sunak's possibly thinking about an international AI summit. It sounds to me like global cooperation is really necessary on this, and it needs to cross borders, and companies need to be held to account. So all those things that were just said, I think, are a really important solution.
Do you think we can get a grip on this?
I think partly discussing this now, Jo, so that voters are educated. I could take 30 seconds of audio from you, and I could make a video with existing technology. You saying I was by far the best panellist on, Politics Live today, and my arguments were much better than Carolyn. And the human, the human ear wouldn't be able to tell that what I produced from you was fake. And so the Electoral Commission, I think, is probably the body that probably needs to be resourced, because I think you can, as the professor was saying, develop technology that can tell that things are fake, but the human ear can't. And so the voters being aware that this technology exists is probably the best defence that we have.
What would you like to see happen?
I think it shows why it's so important to have reliable news outlets again, and we get a lot of news from social media.
Like Politics Live on BBC.
Exactly. There's still a future for it, and people think that the future is very much social media. I think this shows that actually there is very much that grounding there for sources that people trust. Obviously, some countries don't get that with their media. We're very lucky in this country, and as critical as we may be, I think that's something to be cherished. But you get disinformation all the time. Political parties put disinformation out about each other. Twitter is full of it. Facebook is full of it. So it's not a new thing. It's a more sophisticated version of it. And of course, AI, the way it's developed so much in recent years, you feel like it's something from like one of the Terminator films or so on. We have these sort of shape-shifting beings eventually, and not just the leader of the opposition turning from a Corbynite to a Blairite. But just keep an eye on it, I think. But again, there is a real place for real decent.
Just keep an eye. Is that going to be enough, Carolyn?
Definitely not. It needs regulation. Look, as someone who until recently thought that you needed a plumber to install YouTube, I can tell you that this absolutely terrifies me. But having seen the damage that the gambling industry, for example, has been able to assert over punters by monopolising their telephones and making them into casinos 24/7. I know the damage that this kind of technology can do. It has to be regulated, it has to be controlled, it has to be monitored, but we have to keep on top of it. We can't allow it to become historic regulation. It has to be constantly reviewed.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Mike Wooldridge there. That was fascinating listening to you. I just want to show you this headline before we go. In the Times, Prince Harry in court. I'm sure it hasn't passed you by. It's been all over the news. Government is at rock bottom. Duke tells trial. Few seconds. What do you make of that?
Well, once Prince Harry was credible. I'm not sure he's the most credible person anymore, so, yeah. Sad that he's getting involved in politics.
All right, well, that's all we have time for from all of us here. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.